This whole thing with ChatGPT is just history replaying itself. We just need to stop viewing tech and innovation as a veritable silver bullet for all of the world's problems and instead understand that it can actually scale inequities at warp speed. And we need to, stop being so ridiculous about it.
All year on this podcast, we've been talking about the potential for generative AI, how it will change academia, our economy, our very laws, how we are not prepared for the future on our doorstep. What we have not talked about much is that generative AI is still pretty dumb. As recent articles in the New York Times and The Verge, along with countless Twitter posts, have noted, sometimes generative tools like ChatGPT or Bing are nothing more than predictive text. And predictive text can be really, really dumb. And maybe a little crazy. But those predictions have to be drawn from something. And that's where the focus of this week's podcast lies. Because ChatGPT and Bing can also be more than a little racist or exhibit other forms of bias. So joining us is Dr. Sarah Saska, co-founder and CEO of DEI consultancy Feminuity. Dr. Saska walks us through the current state of diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations when it comes to generative AI and the risks of bias in the machine, all of which should sound frustratingly familiar, except for the Algorithmic Justice League, which is both awesome and I swear to God real. As we talked with Dr. Saska, however, it became clear that the complexities of these systems point to problems not only in how the data is sourced and trained, but what happens when it engages with the enemy, i.e., people on the internet. Remember, early attempts at chatbots turned pretty super Nazi real quick because they were soaking up conversations from the internet. Most people on the net have a pretty big fuck around and find out energy. We've already seen what's happened when our fellow health citizens were unleashed on Bing. What happens when Bing starts learning from what the trolls are doing to it? Look, this podcast has always been about discussing technology's power to affect change at massive scale. Good, bad, or stupid. I think generative AI will soon test what's worse. Bias on the data side or user bad faith on the other? Let's dig in. We don't often do this, Sarah. Given the topic today, it's probably worthwhile talking a little bit about your CV and what you do at Feminuity, because I think that's going to kind of set the credentials for us to have a little bit of the exploratory conversation we're about to. So for people unfamiliar with Feminuity and maybe DEI in general, can you give us the broad strokes?
So Feminuity is a full-service diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy firm. Functionally, we do what many in the field of practice do. So we work with organizations to help them to build diverse teams, to build more equitable systems, and to ultimately build inclusive products and workplace cultures.
So the reason why we have you on to talk about that, beyond it just being in and of itself an important topic, is we've been exploring this year new technologies, generative AI particularly, and trying to understand all the different hot button touch points it's going to interact with in terms of society, business, art, and creativity. I think for this, the reason why we were so interested in speaking to you is that there's been a lot of conversation about the power of generative AI as a tool set for use, but there hasn't been a lot of conversation around the human implications of that, not only for people in the workplace, but then also I think how these tools are created. One thing that's been really interesting to me is that with generative AI, we are thinking a lot about the outputs, but not what's being extracted to create the data sets to allow for the generative AI component. Those are two really big topics in and of themselves. I just want to set that up and maybe let you roll a bit and say top of mind when you're looking at generative AI from a DEI framework standpoint, where does the first place your head go? What is top of mind for you in your field that you think people need to be either paying attention to or not paying attention enough?
Yeah, so many good questions just sort of wrapped up in this here.
It's a turducken of a question, and we'll slowly eat it
Absolutely.
over the course of the podcast.
I guess for me, my PhD was in the ethical and equitable design of technology and innovation writ large. So I looked at how technologists, programmers, researchers, and so forth can be intentional with how they develop AI, machine learning, and so forth, and what that all looks like from both a historical and sort of futurism's perspective. For me, I always look at history and future sort of simultaneously. So in the long-standing history of sort of tech and innovation, there's these always wild expectations at the inception of anything new, right? Once upon a time, we believed that airplanes would bring about world peace or that movies would make schools completely obsolete, right? When we look at these histories, it becomes clear that there's no form of tech or innovation that's inevitable, right? The march of progress, while relentless, always takes many, many unexpected turns along the way, right? Sometimes it works out okay and in our favor, and then sometimes it hurts us. And by us, I mean our collective society, our world, a whole heck of a lot.
That's an us.
Yeah.
We have a collective us and we usage on this podcast. We're a Big Tent podcast. We can go there.
Okay. So, like, not to be all doom and gloom on OpenAI's ChatGPT, but I think it's a good time to remind ourselves that any form of tech is merely an extension of its creators, of our collective history, and then also its active users. Technologies are built on our data sets. The data sets reflect our collective histories, which are ultimately histories of exclusion and discrimination, right? All sorts of forms of isms and inequities. And then these same texts are, shaped by us actively on an ongoing basis, so they reflect our current and sort of future behaviors. So in this way, we don't need explicit forms of exclusion or discrimination to be sexist or racist or ableist, right? It's just been happening by virtue of AI.
Okay, let's actually pause and unpack that a little bit. It's a topic we've talked about tangentially, I think, on this podcast, and certainly in our reporting on BetaKit. But before we actually get to like the ChatGPT or any of the generative AIs, let's just talk about how this intersects with AI in general, because I want to make it really clear for our listeners kind of what you're referring to. Now, they've probably seen stories about implicit bias in AI, whether it's being unable to recognize the facial complexion of people of color, or, Microsoft releases a chatbot on Twitter and in 5 seconds it's a super Nazi, omega racist because it pulled in tweets from Twitter as its data set. You had said something actually interesting before we started recording, that when looking at the generative AI component, it's actually really similar to just AI's intersection with DI broadly. What is that intersection? Is it really just a focus on human society has these biases and they're being pulled into these systems or these data sets at scale, and that could be really bad if unchecked? Like, what's the current stance on ethical AI use from a DEI perspective? Because it's been a topic of conversation, but I'm not sure anyone's gotten further than it's really important not to be biased.
Okay, so I'd say at a really sort of foundational level, what we need to remember when we're talking about any type of AI is that they are only as good as their creators. Technology relies on humans, i.e., the humans are literally doing the programming and all of the work, as well as all of our collective data, our historical data, right? So all the data that we've all contributed to over the course of our lifetime and well beyond, to come together to actually create the tool, right? So in this way, technology is not more objective than people. It's merely just an extension of us, right? Of our collective history, as well as a programmer's bias and so forth. AI are built on our data sets. These data reflect our collective histories that are, chock filled with exclusion and discrimination. And then in turn, over time, we actively work and shape these types of AI by how we use them, right? By the types of questions that we ask them, by how we interact with them, and so forth.
Obviously, if you're coming from a perspective where you only train your tool with photos of white people, it's going to be really good at identifying white people and not recognizing that people of color are that way. It's that next point I think is interesting when we get to the generative component, that like this is also isn't a fixed system, that it's evolving. And I know that we've been seeing some stories of people going at ChatGPT and basically social engineering it to like malfunction. There's a great story in the Washington Post about like how a group of, I would just generally consider internet trolls, have jailbroken ChatGPT and turned it into something called Dan and it's gone haywire. There's a number of examples of the component right now that is in the Bing search engine just freaking out on users because it's not capable of engaging in the way that we might hope. I guess when you're looking at consulting or providing recommendations for the design of systems to like be cognizant of the biases, what kind of considerations are we looking at where it's like we can actually, like, it's not just making sure we have diverse models or we're not including the bad parts of society into the system. If we come to the chat tool not with our best foot forward, we can make it worse. Like that almost seems to be, to sum it up, beyond a design consideration and way more of a UX always on consideration. Like, are we going to need the equivalent of a driver's license to have to use ChatGPT so that we don't turn it racist or dumb or evil? Like how are we going to need to change to interact with these tools? Or is it us?
I think that's such an interesting question. I love the idea of a driver's license or something of the like.
I think more people should have licenses for things, whether it's kids or pets, tools, how many phones you own in your house. We should be very much, podcast hosts should be certified. But sorry, please continue.
So I think it's a few different pieces. For sure, it's, at really fundamental overarching levels, it's about governance and ethical standards, right? With AI promising to affect every aspect of our lives, then we need governance and ethical standards that are of equal importance, because our capacity to defend ourselves against algorithmic harms ultimately is constrained by our collective ability to articulate what those even look and feel like, right? Which also leads to the need for just mass education. One of my points of frustration is that what we're seeing with ChatGPT and generative AI is not unlike the issues we've seen with AI since the 1970s and what, researchers and ethicists have been sort of sounding the alarm on since the 1970s, that they're not fundamentally different. It's just that this is a hot topic that suddenly became more mainstream, right? It suddenly became more of a dinner table conversation.
Well, you can use it, you can try it on your phone, right? It's actually tangible.
Totally. And so I think this is a really important moment to really introduce the idea of critical computing. So whether you are an educator developing curriculum, whether you're a programmer like a student in high school, or you're someone who's retooling to find a new job in the workforce, if you're going to be part of this process and be part of the design of AI, you need to engage with critical computing. So this is effectively an analytical approach to understanding how to critique computer algorithms, which is considered just as important as learning how to program, right? So it starts with questioning the hype around AI at a fundamental level and its potential side effects, and then being really attuned to the possible shadow side of anything. So it means your fundamental approach to programming is different, right? You're not viewing it as an absolute source of truth or this sort of neutral entity. You're viewing it as this complex system that you are a part of and you need to engage in a really critical way with sort of like an ethical contract of sorts.
Okay. Because if you treat this system the way that you would your normal computer, where it's like, hey, please don't like unplug that thing in, or you make sure to power it down, update your apps. But like there's more to it than that, because it's not a steady state of fixed system. You can interact with this thing in such a way that can ruin it a little bit. You use the word education, which I think is really interesting, because I think one of the things that's become very clear for all the AI conversations we've been having is that not only are we super behind in general education of like what this is truly about. I'm very much concerned from like the deep fake implications of generative AI and just seeing the issues that people have with social media and disinformation and misinformation. And that's for stuff that like for any sort of digital literacy is like obviously wrong. When you have a robot that can sound like, take my audio clippings from the 300 plus podcasts I've recorded to perfectly sound like me saying something horrible, which I will say now, I'm just putting that idea out there. If I ever get canceled, it was the generative AI. It wasn't something I said. I've been very much concerned about that, like educating people to understand the difference between factually true information and generative nonsense. It seems like from the AI consideration, we aren't really sure what to educate people about because we're not really sure what the implications are. So like when you're doing this work, like what's the 2023 like most up to date syllabus on like what that education looks like? Has it been written? Are we ready to educate people on how not to screw this stuff up?
So I definitely think we're creating the plan as we're going along for sure. For me, one of the most critical things to start with is getting people to get beyond the hype. We know that, like with most forms of sort of new tech and innovation, we get enamored with this, productive possibility of what it may be, but we just don't map out the shadow side of it, right? So then we aren't orienting ourselves towards it in a manner that considers, all of the possible consequences, and we're not sort of being as ethical as we need and as intentional as we need to be.
Do you have examples of that? Like, I think our podcast listeners will be familiar with my darkest timeline takes, but is there something that you're particularly tracking where you're like, oh man, this sector, this industry is really not paying attention to this? Like, are you comfortable with the idea right now that both like two of the world's largest technology companies, in Microsoft and Google, are just YOLO public launching conversational AI tools into like the web browsers that people use? Like that seems to be the opposite of like a thoughtful, considered approach where it just shows up in Bing or in Google search one day.
Oh, totally. I think it's terrifying when tech companies are valued at more than entire countries and governments and then play in this sort of veritable gray space, right? Where policies and regulations aren't able to keep up with their pace of evolution. Really, we are playing with all of our futures. Like they are playing with all of our futures in that way. And that's why to me it just keeps coming back to like governance and ethical standards, and no one can keep up because we're all chasing money, right? At fundamental level, these are money making tools. Like startups are chasing it as well. And they're just far less concerned about keeping pace with the sort of the human consequences of it all.
Hey, calling all hardware and semiconductor focused startups. Venture Lab is excited to announce the application call for their Hardware Catalyst Initiative program is now open. As Canada's leading hardware hub, the Hardware Catalyst Initiative program enables the creation of transformative technologies that will power the products of tomorrow, helping ventures become competitive players in the ever-changing global semiconductor industry. Chosen applicants will have access to state-of-the-art equipment in their $7 million lab, in addition to tools, resources, expertise, and mentorship to get your product off the ground. Visit their website at venturelab.ca and apply today. From February 27th to March 31st, join changemakers across Canada for the 5th annual International Women's Week. Throughout International Women's Week, the Invest Ottawa community will host over 25 powerful events to participate in. But International Women's Week is far more than a set of activities. It is a call for long-term sustainable change. BetaKit is proud to join forces under a shared goal to inspire, equip, and empower more women. To learn more about how you can join in, visit www.investottawa.ca/IWW. The commercial interest component here, I think, is noteworthy given we've seen Google, after months and years of saying we don't want to introduce something that we've been working on because we are the internet for the world's population, and that would be wrong. And then the minute that Microsoft's share price skyrocketed because of the OpenAI ChatGPT relationship, out comes Google with their counter version. I want to maybe talk a little bit about some of those ethical standards and guideposts that you're referring to, because I think for the average listener here, they might be like, okay, yeah, that seems like do no harm or like be nice to people. Like, what are some of the considerations there that you're referring to that need to be applied when it comes to this technology, either in its use and like how it's dispersed or like how people engage with it? Like, are there some easy kind of like 10 commandment rules that people can be more familiar with? Is it kind of complex and noodly? Like, what kind of level of ethics are we talking about here?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I've seen so many different examples, but I really do think it depends on the industry right now. We're witnessing the utility of these types of tools, say, in the criminal justice system, right? So, not an uncomplex territory, right? So, law enforcement has been using AI to assess people in the prison industrial complex to determine if they will reoffend ultimately, right? And there was a study from like 2016 or so that found that Black people were twice as likely as white people to be misclassified by the technology. And like the deep irony is that these tools were used in the first place because judges are deemed to be so biased, right? Judges, aka humans, are biased. So they turn to this seemingly neutral technology.
They offload the responsibility of the decision making.
Totally. And where it's being used in healthcare and, all sorts of places that are certainly workplaces, but also, systems that impact all of us, whether directly or indirectly, depending on, who we are.
What I'm hearing from you is that like the kind of do no harm principle needs to be applied differently for every sector, which in itself is an additional layer of complexity here. I want to maybe put a pin in that because that is a massive consideration that we're obviously not prepared for. I want to just go to the other side because you're talking about education, ethical pillars, considerations that need to be made for like best practice use. Let's just talk about the other side of the human coin, which is like our capacity to just like fuck around and find out. Essentially, the fact that the people most interested in using these tools right now are the types of people that are like, let's set fire to this thing and see what happens. Let's mash these things to like, let's just play around in a sandbox and see if the sandbox catches on fire. I referenced ChatGPT's evil alter ego Dan before and things like that. That is just being done by a certain contingent of the internet that's like, let's see how quickly we can break something. Like it's almost as if it's a game. Knowing as someone who plays games and does similar behaviors in contained environments where no one is harmed, only pixels, is there even a consideration of how we protect the generative AI tools from human beings? Beyond education, how do we create a system that protects people that are not necessarily assuming the best intentions from actively making these tools worse for everyone else? Because we've seen with social media, there was like a 2-year period. Everyone was posting photos of their brunch. It was great. It was really chill. And then it was hellfire and the worst thing in the world because every person was on the internet acting in all the ways that human beings act, but it got sent to like millions of people rather than just being in your neighborhood. Like, how do we stop the bad people in the world, which is all of us, from putting our bad behaviors onto these tools that are going to absorb them and learn from them? Yeah. Is it really the AI license? Like, is it going to be like you're going to need a license to use generative tools lest you corrupt them with like original human sin? Like, I take the point on education. I just can't get over this idea of like every person I know on social media and the internet is a total dipwad. And I don't want them anywhere near these things because these are powerful tools that they can use for lulls or evil or both.
Yeah. So I think it's like there's sort of, if we look at two different users, user A who like approaches this technology as, oh, this is awesome. This is perfect. This will just make me, do my job that much more quickly. And I'll just, use it along the side throughout the day and work about 2 hours a day, right? Like they're going to use the tool uncritically and they're going to stumble into all sorts of like unconscious forms of bias. Whereas then you have user B who is, the sort of the dark side of the interwebs, right?
They chose violence.
Who's actively, exactly. They're choosing violence with the tool. And what they're basically showcasing are forms of explicit bias, right? Like they're actively searching and seeking for it. So like we need community standards for that side of it, but then we also need user A to also have a different orientation altogether where we don't view this as a veritable silver bullet, right? That we don't view it as a perfect solution. So it's like both sort of user A and B, both orientations don't work. Like, so our team, we have been using it for all sorts of reasons to like literally explore, test. It's fun. It's interesting. I like your, philosophy of, fuck around and find out for sure. And so, like, as we're in the middle of Black History Month, Black Futures Month, we literally just finished updating our resource on the mainstream appropriation of Black American English. And so we were actually trying to use a tool to like develop some of the content, to explore it, and so forth. And what we discovered using the tool is that actually ChatGPT, it relies on sort of standard forms of English. So it erases this sort of the diversity of languages and dialects. So it for sure erases the use of Black American English. Right. So for people who don't know, like Black American English or Ebonics, it's the language that's established and spoken by Black people in the US and North America more broadly. So think words like lit, woke, bae, slay, hella, and so forth.
Most of the social media Twitter conversation, right? Like that's a direct.
Exactly. But ChatGPT actually prioritizes standard forms of English, such as standard American English or, the Queen's English, which is deeply tied to colonialism, where, Black American English is actually meant as sort of resistance to different types of colonialism. So what's really interesting is if something like ChatGPT actually ends up, if we take it to the nth degree and it becomes sort of the norm, the standard, we're going to lose so much culture, so much resistance, colonial, standards around language. Like there are just so many consequences that we can't even think through yet.
Let's try not to think through all of them, but at least some of them, because I know one of the places I wanted to get to with this and that my co-host Rob really wanted me to ask is like, we see it as two sides to this, like a bias that goes into the data set and then the bias that maybe comes out or is engaged with the user. But we've just spent a lot of time talking about how that isn't a one-way, one-time flow. It's a cycle. There's a feedback loop and it changes things. In the example that you just gave, like I could see a lot of people being like, we are establishing a de facto colonial usage of the English language, which prioritizes certain individuals and keeps out others. Meanwhile, the alternative to that is like, before you use the chat tool, hey, how do you self-identify? And then we're going to modify the language model to approximate how we should speak to you. Is really one of the questions that we had is like, from a DEI perspective, like what are the DEI considerations back onto the individuals using these tools when the tool talks back to you? How do we create a framework where we're not either gentrifying or characterizing certain ethnic groups and individuals just to give the robot tool kind of some default parameters? Because it's problematic and fraught to use one standard form of English, but it's just as problematic to have a tool identify you by your age, height, gender, race, and those things, and then give you something that it doesn't give anyone else on the assumption that you only want to speak in Ebonics or certain types of languages. Like, I guess maybe the first question is, can the technology even handle doing more than like one type of language set right now?
Oh, probably not. It's not like we expect it to sort of be beyond that. It's just interesting that from a design perspective, white colonizer sort of language of English, standard English was chosen as the default, right? Like, so there was already sort of so many design decisions that were made from day one, right? Literally by the developers. And I think that really just goes back to how deeply homogenous the sort of research and sort of programming around AI just is, right? Like it's still really dominated by like white dudes, and it's sort of old news by now, but like this is a really clear consequence of that, like come to light.
Yeah, like new implications of the same problems. I'm thinking actually, as you were talking about this, of like one place we can easily see the evolution right now is in dating apps. Because there used to be like one or two dating apps that everyone was on, and then you realize that they're prioritizing certain races, heights, or whatever. And then even just walking around Toronto last week, seeing ads for an Indian-focused dating apps. Like the evolution of this isn't making the one app be something that a wide variety of people can use. There has been a balkanization, and now we're getting all of these micro apps, which for some people like, oh, these are people like me that I want to identify with. It's a much stronger collective than I'm seeking. But then it also means that we are creating these like social silos where no one talks to each other anymore. And that's for the dating app. Now let's apply this to the conversational AI tools that we're going to start using every day. And it's like, I already don't like the fact that Google knows my entire search history and shows, like, I can't see the same search results that you see. I'm not sure if I'm comfortable being spoken to in a certain way because Google assumed that my Northern Ontario dialect is how I wanted to be like it's like, oh, Google knows that it has to say no, yeah, when it means yes to me because I'm from Sault Ste. Marie, like stuff like that. I don't know if I want to be carrying around that experience with every digital tool that I use. Does that make sense?
Totally. But then also that's sort of one of those humanization like factors that we want from it in other ways. But I think your dating app thing is really interesting. Like one of the reasons that had to be true is because, AI, like facial recognition portions were actually privileging like Eurocentric standards of beauty, right? And like actually just ranking down certain, races and ethnicities, which that
The
sucks.
algorithm by its nature prioritizes certain types of content over others. And that is, yeah.
Totally.
Okay. Well, we also know that one of the particularities of these generative AI tools is that they're also not able or designed to give you the same answer twice, which I think will make it very difficult for them to be as catered or as curated in the way that our Google search results are, right? Because you can ask it the same question twice. You are not getting the same Google search result, not because Google has tons of metadata on you and is trying to serve you a different ad, but like the tool itself can't do the same answer twice. So just for our listeners who had listened to past podcasts, I did remember that point. We're not forgetting it. We're trying to talk through implications. I guess maybe to switch it around and be a little bit more proactive or maybe positive. Let's see. Do you have examples of organizations, tools, products that you're seeing be really thoughtful in either their rollouts, how they're productizing these tools, maybe the caution through which they're doing that, like any sort of signals of best practices or thoughtful leadership in the space? Does that exist right now, or is it full YOLO, fuck around, find out?
So I love the Algorithmic Justice League. It's a digital advocacy. It's a nonprofit based in Cambridge. Yeah, have you checked them out?
I thought you were making a joke, and then I realized that this is a real thing. That is the most
Oh, it's
awesome thing in the
real.
world. So the Algorithmic Justice League. Please tell our listeners more about this.
Oh, yeah. So they're just doing really incredibly thoughtful work. They approach AI with, productive possibility, but also a really good critical frame. And they're trying to break down really tangible ways for developers, programmers to actually just do better. I also think the nonprofit research institute Data and Society is awesome. They, again, have a really healthy sort of approach to all of this. And they're looking at how AI is affecting every sector and industry, from climate change to child welfare to diabetes monitoring to elder care and beyond.
How is it healthy? Just because they're looking at that stuff, or is there something in the way that they're looking at? Like, what is it? Just literally, this is a group that's finally sitting around and just looking at this stuff and thinking about it, or is there a methodology to this approach?
Yeah, I guess for me, healthy is they're not viewing technology as inherently good or bad. They're just really trying to bring a critical, frame of curiosity.
So everything we didn't see with social media.
Totally, yeah. And really, they are looking at how it impacts every sector and industry. And I also love the Center for Humane Technology. So another nonprofit. They talk about being dedicated to radically reimagining the digital infrastructure as a whole. And they're trying to shift towards humane technology that supports people's collective well-being and shared understanding of how to use it.
I'm really glad that you mentioned these organizations, and we will link to them in the notes that go up with this podcast. I do feel at this moment it's worthy to call out the fact that at no point did you mention an organization with like 100 million active users like OpenAI, or billions of dollars in cash reserves or revenue like Microsoft or Google. Is there a corporate entity, a technology company producing this stuff right now that you're seeing adopting the thoughtfulness that these not-for-profits are? Or is that the dividing line? Because I made the social media joke earlier. There was a lot of great social media think tanks, even based here in Toronto and Canada, that were being like, maybe Facebook shouldn't let people live stream stuff, because what happens if people start live streaming suicides? And then it happened. For as much as their tech leaders throw up their hands and say, we didn't know, there was a definite contingent of digital and socially literate people who were saying, no, we knew, we tried to tell you, you didn't listen. Is that happening again? Are we once again looking to the nonprofits to be thoughtful while literally the CEO of Microsoft is launching a product just to make Google dance and shave a few points of market share?
Totally. I think political interest, political and economic interest really do seem to get in the way here. These nonprofits are a blend of academics and ethicists and technologists and former technologists from major, tech companies, and just sort of a blend. Like they truly are a diversity of people with a range of perspectives and experiences coming together and doing what we know to be true, right? Bringing those perspectives together to come up with a better purview on the conversation.
I don't feel like you answered my question, but that was an answer to my question in and of itself, which is fine. Because again, we're here for your thoughtful takes on things, not necessarily like solutions. But I will say, maybe to bring it back to the organization that you run, from my understanding, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of established practices here at the AI level. It's an evolving process. What are the types of things that you're exploring with your clients right now, or the things that they're worried about, or like lowest hanging fruit top of mind? Because from a DEI perspective, like companies are still trying to understand how to like adopt that in their hiring practices and things like that. Like we just had the mayor of the city that we're in resign for having a relationship with an employee. Like we don't actually need technology to be a component for like DEI to still be something that society is grappling with. When you're working with clients from an AI lens, what are the things that they're asking about first, or what are the things that you're kind of hitting with them with first?
So when we're meeting with an engineering team and like helping them sort of at that product inclusion 101 stage, we are having to go to really foundational sort of DEI pragmatic stuff. Like we're having to teach them about social issues, different forms of inequity, different types of isms, and then we're helping them sort of trace how that could actually link to the design of what they're doing. And, just like really basic stuff, like their basic architectural design. What I'm struggling with is like, why are we, getting all these sort of programmers, engineers, and so forth, like coming out of school with such a gap in sort of understanding, to begin with, right?
So even when people are coming to you being like, hey, ChatGPT, what, blah, 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 you're like, hey, let's go back to school and learn DEI literacy and how you should be applying that elsewhere, because
So yeah, we're having to do that level set for sure. And then we're having to work with them on literally diversifying the composition of the teams in and of themselves. And then we're working with them to design sort of, checklists and like some basic protocol for companies themselves to actually be following as they're sort of mapping through their tech development process.
I'm struck by how early days all of this sounds. And I guess it shouldn't be surprising given that ChatGPT kind of really rolled out for public use in November. That feels like a million years ago. It seems like we are excited at the prospect of reopening Pandora's box before we even dealt with like the last box we opened. Let's take this away from the technology standpoint just for a second. I want to go to something that we had kind of been talking about over email prior to recording, because we had mentioned this off the top of the podcast, that there's like how you engage with the tool, how the tool is trained, how the data set is collected. And you and your team had sent some stuff over noting exactly how the model for OpenAI, the data was trained a bit. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think separate from, regardless of how that technology works, regardless of how the tools are used, what they're used for, there's a human cost to the extractive process of creating this that I think is worth not overlooking, and I'd love to have you speak to.
Yeah. So I think this sort of hit the news cycle pretty recently. and this is not specific to OpenAI and ChatGPT, but like an often overlooked component of the creation of generative AI is exploitative labor practices, typically from those in developing or underdeveloped contexts. So, in particular, OpenAI hired a bunch of folks in Kenya to filter through harmful text and images to basically help to train the data to recognize different types of harmful content. And so there's a whole expose about, the workers involved, one indicating sort of their experience of trauma while having to read and label the text for OpenAI. Some cited it as a process that, felt like torture because of the traumatic nature of the text and so forth. And of course, I think it goes without saying that these folks are, deeply underpaid. And I certainly suspect they're not coming with, full benefits and employment packages along the way either.
There's no union.
No.
Okay. And again, that is exactly from the playbook that we've seen with social media, right?
Absolutely.
And it's like these behaviors, these activities are happening at scale. And to a certain extent, you can use human work power to mitigate that. But even when we're looking to use AI tool sets, because we don't fully trust them, those need to be managed and overseen by human beings. So they need to see the horrible thing. Anyways, I guess to your point, this seems to be the same story over and over again, regardless of the technology, which isn't necessarily where I thought we'd end up. I thought we were going to maybe talk about some new weird implications, which we kind of did. We talked about dating apps, but the connectivity to the stuff that we always talk about on this podcast, I think is insightful and useful. Is there anything else that we haven't addressed? Something that maybe even further afield you're looking at, like the implications of the implications, or, the questions you ponder late at night that you want to toss out to our audience that maybe they can chew on a bit and hopefully look to contribute, or at least avoid some of the behaviors that we've identified as problematic or just not cool?
Yeah, for me, this whole thing with ChatGPT is just history replaying itself again. Like, really, it doesn't feel like any of the, case studies we've been reviewing around AI and ML over the last 20, 30 years. It just feels like the latest, greatest form of hype, right? We just need to stop viewing tech and innovation as a veritable silver bullet for all of the world's problems, and instead understand that it can actually scale inequities at warp speed. And we need to, stop being so ridiculous about it. We just keep getting enamored over and over.
I think that's probably the perfect place to end it, because I don't think there's a follow-up to that. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Maybe look to have you on again in the future, either as an I told you so to when people find out, or maybe to continue to unpack these things as we get deeper in the fucking around of these tools.
I love it. I'm glad this is a swear-friendly environment.
It's the only way we can't be replaced by the robots.
We have a whole guide on approaches to swearing in the workplace, should you ever need it.
I am going to send you an email about that later on.
We broke down swears by DEI considerations. So, fuck is a great swear word. Bitch, not so much, right? It's loaded. It's got it's a heavy loaded sort of word. And we break down sort of why we think not all swear words are created equally.
Okay, we are going to definitely do a follow-up podcast about that for sure. The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.